Chapter 10, Shepherds of the Flock. If a certain man comes to have 100 sheep, and one of them gets strayed, will he not leave the 99 upon the mountains and set out on a search for the one that is stray? And if he happens to find it, I certainly tell you, he rejoices more over it than over the 99 that have not strayed. Matthew chapter 18, verse 12. Speaking of his sheep, Jesus gave the assurance that they would know his voice, adding, "A stranger they will by no means follow, but will flee from him, because they do not know the voice of strangers." The footnote references John 10, verses 4 and 5. In reading the Scriptures, we do come to know the voice of the true shepherd, learn to distinguish it from voices that do not ring true. His voice expresses itself in a way that perfectly harmonizes with the description he gave of himself in this call to his sheep. Quote, "Come to me, all you who are toiling and loaded down, and I will refresh you. Take my yoke upon you and become my disciples, for I am mild-tempered and lowly in heart, and you will find refreshment for your souls. For my yoke is kindly and my load is light." Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 through 30. Today, as in the past, there are people in many places who are leading religious affiliations of long standing, doing so for the very reason that they do not hear the voice of the Good Shepherd in the proclamations of their respective religions, do not hear a call to refreshment and relief, but hear instead a strident call for total submission to human authority. The voice they hear is out of harmony with the instruction Christ gave his disciples in saying, quote, "You know that in the world rulers lord it over their subjects, and their great men make them feel the weight of authority, but it shall not be so with you." The footnote references Matthew 20, 25, and 26, New English Bible. Sometime after I wrote Crisis of Conscience, a friend loaned me a copy of an earlier book with a notably similar title, A Question of Conscience. The footnote reads, "I was unaware of this book at the time of writing my own, but I had seriously considered using the same title." The author Charles Davis had been born in England of parents of the Roman Catholic faith. He states that in his youth, quote, "The claim of the Roman Church to be the one true church was taken for granted as an assured fact. The Catholic Church remained for me right into adult life, an unquestioned and unchangeable part of reality. It dominated my world." From the age of 15, he pursued an ecclesiastical vocation as his goal in life. Though our religious heritages seemed worlds apart, Jehovah's Witnesses resembling a small pond in contrast to the vast ocean of Catholicism, I felt the bond of mutual experience, having held those very same feelings regarding the religion of my heritage. Charles Davis spent over 20 years in the priesthood and became a leading Catholic theologian of Great Britain. He traveled widely in giving lectures both in Britain and overseas. Then, in 1966, he decided to leave the religion of his birth. Whatever other parallels with my own experience that had impressed me, it was in reading his reasons for taking this major step, abandoning a belief system and a religious career that had spanned his entire life, that I felt the closest affinity, felt most deeply moved. He wrote, quote, "I remain a Christian, but I have come to see that the Church as it exists and works at present is an obstacle in the lives of the committed Christians I know and admire. It is not the source of values they cherish and promote. On the contrary, they live and work in a constant tension and opposition to it. For me, Christian commitment is inseparable from concern for truth and concern for people. I do not find either of these represented by the official Church. There is concern for authority at the expense of truth, and I am constantly saddened by instances of the damage done to persons by workings of an impersonal and unfree system. Further, I do not think that the claim that church makes as an institution rests upon any adequate biblical and historical basis. The footnote references Charles Davis, A Question of Conscience, London, Hodder and Stoughton, 1967, page 16. In a parallel way, it was not the realization that errors existed within the Watchtower organization's teachings that most seriously affected me, for I did not feel that I could expect perfection when I myself was imperfect. It was primarily the spirit manifest that most deeply disturbed me, for I saw a similar concern for authority at the expense of truth, and an accompanying damage done to persons by workings of an impersonal and unfree system. Concern for authority clearly overshadowed concern for people. There are, among Jehovah's Witnesses, both in this country and in other countries, many, many persons for whom I feel true affection. I can honestly say that there are those still associated with that organization whom I admire. But I admire them for what they are as persons, for I am convinced that they are what they are, not because of the organization in which they find themselves, but, in many respects, in spite of the organization. The qualities and spirit they themselves have are not reflective of that which comes down from the official organization. As Charles Davis put it, it is not the source of values they cherish and promote in their dealings with others. And their conscientious effort to hold to biblical principles and exemplify Christian qualities often creates inner tensions for them for that very reason. They must, I believe, feel an uneasy sense of risk whenever they express themselves on certain issues. What kind of shepherding? In a witness community, elders and others in positions of responsibility are told to be like the shepherds described in Jesus' illustration, quoted at the beginning of this chapter. That illustration conveys a beautiful picture, one of a shepherd's earnest concern for a single sheep, seen not simply as part of a flock or as a mere number, but as an individual creature needing his help, care, and protection. The description is in striking contrast to that given of religious shepherds of an earlier day, to whom the prophet Ezekiel addressed these words, quote, "You have not encouraged the weary, tended the sick, bandaged the hurt, recovered the straggler, or searched for the lost, and even the strong you have driven with ruthless severity." Ezekiel 34:4, New English Bible. I have no question that most witness elders believe themselves to be, and undoubtedly desire to be, like the first shepherd described. But I think that the evidence regrettably shows a high incidence of organizational policies producing a circumstance like that described in the second account, a circumstance where the sheep are consistently pressured by their shepherds, with even the strong being pushed at a demanding pace, but where very, very little time is spent aiding the weary, the sick, the hurt, the straggling, and the lost among them. In congregation after congregation, it is a sad truth that members find that elders have little time to spend with them in periods of difficulty, illness, depression, or discouragement, but that their time is spent primarily in pushing for greater field service activity. They are too busy to provide strengthening and encouraging help, but very prompt to act if there is any suspicion of misconduct, and can then make available many hours for investigation or deliberation. The footnote reads, compare the exhortations at 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 24 through 26, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 14, 15, and 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, 13 through 15, and James chapter 5, 16, 19, and 20. Back to the paragraph. The organization builds up a notable record each year of numbers of persons expelled, 36,638 being disfellowshipped in just the year 1985, with another 37,426 disfellowshipped in 1986. Footnote reads, The Watchtower, January 1st, 1986, page 13, and January 1st, 1987, page 13. Back to the paragraph. Beyond a doubt, a considerable percentage of these persons had engaged in practices of the kind the apostle describes in his exhortation at 1 Corinthians chapter 5, 9 through 13. Practices such as fornication, theft, drunkenness, and similar immoral acts. But while notable in its record of cutting off such ones, the organization's record of helping fellow witnesses who slip into wrongdoing to recover and to reform, of demonstrating willingness not just to spend a few hours, but to give extended personal help over a period of weeks or even many months if necessary to build up their spiritual strength and to aid them to become healed, is, by contrast, notably weak. Problems among the youth of Jehovah's Witnesses are undeniably frequent, and in case after case, the remedy consists only of judicial hearings, not infrequently followed by disfellowshipment. The organization may justly recount specific instances of aiding persons of the world, drug addicts, violent or immoral persons, to leave the wrong path. That often comes as a result of meeting these people in the field service. But once the individual takes the stamp of baptism, the willingness to spend any extended amount of time with him or her, time that is no longer reported as field service, noticeably wanes. Thus, the record of bringing former wrongdoers into the organization, thereby increasing the numerical size of the flock, is considerably better than the record of helping those already in to remain spiritually strong or to recover from a lapse into wrongdoing. The footnote reads, "The turnover rate of members is unusually high, with large numbers leading annually. For data, see Crisis of Conscience, pages 36 and 37. That to the paragraph. This preoccupation with numerical increase is seen in the statement in the 1980 yearbook, page 11, that, quote, "Had it not been for disfellowshippings, the United States would have seen an increase of almost 3.5% in 1979, instead of almost 1.5%. That means that 2% of the total membership was disfellowshipped in that year. What seems incredible is that the factor the organization here focuses on is not the plight of the lost sheep, but the lower percentage of increase reported. How utterly unlike the shepherd of Jesus' parable, who was willing to leave the 99 in his concern to rescue the one strayed sheep." The footnote reads, "At a morning text discussion of the Brooklyn Bethel family, John Booth, a member of the governing body, commenting on the large number of persons who leave the organization annually, not necessarily due to disfellowshipment, said, 'But that doesn't matter, for there are always new ones replacing them each year.'" John Booth himself was actually a kind person. Knowing him well, I believe that his expression simply reflects the viewpoint of the organization, a viewpoint that decades of association have embedded in his thinking. The important thing is increase, numerical increase. Quick to investigate, slow to help. I recall a letter that came to the governing body from a witness whose husband, though baptized, had been inactive for 2 years. The couple went on vacation in a city noted for its gambling casinos, and the husband indulged briefly in some games of chance. Word of this reached the elders, and they summoned him to a hearing. They judged him unrepentant and disfellowshipped him. The wife, in her letter to the governing body, stated that her husband was not a practicing gambler. He had gambled on only one other occasion over 2 years previously, yet had been disfellowshipped. She compared this with her own situation, stating that she herself had previously been guilty of an act of marital unfaithfulness. At first, she wrote, she was horrified at what she had done and was determined that she would never do such a thing again. But she did, and now clearly felt the need of help. She confessed her wrong to the elders, was deemed repentant, and was given reproof. The elders told her that they would meet with her each month to aid her in gaining spiritual strength. She wrote that after 6 months had passed, she finally approached one of the elders and reminded him of this. His reply was that they had been so busy, but that they would be spending time with her soon. The readiness to take judicial action toward persons is in strong contrast to the slowness in providing help, and this is demonstrably true on a broad scale in congregation after congregation. When the Service Department Committee sent this letter to the Service Committee of the governing body, the comment was included that people are being disfellowshipped for gambling when there is evidence that they are not really greedy persons. They added, the question also arose as to why greed has only been used as a disfellowshipping offense when it comes to the matter of gambling. There are others who are far more greedy than an occasional gambler, yet the question is never raised as to whether they are greedy persons and should be called before a judicial committee. Elders themselves have done some soul searching due to the quickness of the organization to engage in a form of police action, but its weakness to provide help on any kind of a continuing basis. One former elder and a witness for over 30 years wrote to the Brooklyn headquarters on August 30th, 1988. He expressed his personal sadness that the organization's description of shepherding by congregation elders as a source of loving help and refreshment simply did not fit the facts. Offering one case in point, he states, quote, while serving as an elder in the Warrenton, Virginia congregation, I went with the presiding overseer to investigate an alleged indiscretion reported via telephone from the elders of a neighboring congregation about an elderly, inactive, widowed sister living in yet another congregation's territory, taking care of a comatose old lady for her livelihood. When we arrived, he questioned the sister about her supposed indiscretion. The charge was based purely on conjecture. Her reply was, it has been over 7 years since my husband's death. I have become inactive and haven't attended meetings for years, and not an elder has ever visited me. Yet recently you heard a rumor that I have done something wrong, and you run down here ready to disfellowship me. I don't understand you, brothers. Due to the prevalence of such an organizational attitude, and after having served for 24 years in various positions of responsibility, the writer of the letter resigned his eldership. In his letter of resignation, he stated that he and his wife would appreciate the Christ-like love, consideration, and support of the congregation. He met with the visiting circuit overseer and the other elders in November 1987 to discuss his resignation of eldership. 9 months later, in a letter to the Brooklyn headquarters, he states, quote, from that meeting until this present date, August 25th, 1988, not one of the elders, including W. Parks, the circuit overseer, during his subsequent visit to Warrenton, came to see us to give us any support, spiritually or otherwise. Although the elders found no time to render any support or encouragement, after 9 months of being virtually ignored, he then received a phone call from them citing him for our judicial hearing. Rather than endure the emotional stress of such a hearing, he decided to submit a letter of resignation from the organization itself. A scriptural practice practiced unscripturally. I have no desire to imply that the persons involved, as, for example, witness elders referred to, are themselves without natural compassion and feeling. I am sure that with many that is not the case. The footnote reads, the feelings expressed by the elder whose letter was just quoted illustrate that compassion can be found among witness elders. What follows is to demonstrate the effects of a system to illustrate what sad, at times almost unbelievable consequences can result when individuals let a religious system take over the exercise of their conscience, the hardening, unnatural effect this can exercise on human feelings. And it must be said that this undeniably does create an atmosphere in which any who might incline to be domineering or unfeeling can prosper, while those who are of a compassionate nature find themselves faced with possible charges of lack of loyalty to the organization if they express that compassion. This information is likewise not to be taken as expressing any opposition to the withdrawal of fellowship from wrongdoers of itself. It is biblically taught. It can serve the healthful purpose of protecting persons against corrupting influences and the corrosion of Christian belief and standards. The problem is that what is biblically taught, in many cases, is not what is practiced. The Apostle Paul's words in his first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 5, for example, are used or misused in a legalistic way that is contrary to what is there said. On the basis of a case of extreme immorality within the Corinthian congregation, one that even the permissive standards of the Gentiles condemned, Paul warned of the danger this represented for the whole congregation and said, quote, I have written you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people, not at all meaning the people of this world who are immoral or the greedy and swindlers or idolaters. In that case, you would have to leave this world. But now I am writing that you must not associate with anyone who calls himself a brother but is sexually immoral or greedy, an idolater or a slanderer, a drunkard or a swindler. With such a man, do not even eat. Expel the wicked man from your number. The footnote references 1 Corinthians chapter 5, 9 through 11 and verse 13, New International Version. His words deal not with persons claiming to be Christians who have at some time been guilty of an act or acts of immorality, greed, drunkenness, or similar wrongdoing, but with persons claiming to be Christians who are immoral, who are greedy, who are drunkards, and so forth. A person's getting drunk on one occasion does not make him a drunkard. And in the same way, an act of immorality does not automatically make one a fornicator or immoral person. The apostle's words clearly related to a continuing course of life, a characteristic and distinguishing factor in what the person actually is. Adherence to this apostolic instruction should present no complex problem for Christians. We should not find it difficult to decide whether an individual is one who, if invited into our homes, would represent a clear danger, a corrupting influence to the morality and Christian faith of our family, our children. In Watchtower policy, however, this apostolic instruction has been applied in a way that converts it into the basis for a complicated, formalistic exercise of legal authority whereby those supposed to serve as spiritual shepherds often become little more than spiritual policemen, even detectives, prosecutors, court judges, and imposers of sanctions, a system that seems in many respects to be patterned after the law enforcement and judicial systems of the world, with initial courts and appeal courts and prescribed procedures, modes of sentencing, and probationary arrangements. Elders even form an ecclesiastical court before whom divorce actions must first be cleared as acceptable if remarriage is contemplated. The organization's policies, in effect, establish a confessional arrangement, with elders serving as father confessors, to whom all serious sins must be confessed, and who can grant absolution if they so decide. And, as will be seen, they produce an informer system, with each member feeling duty-bound to report any deviation from the congregational norm on the part of any member, unless that person goes himself to the confessional of the outer body. At the same time, this results in an attitude and climate in which individuals who fall into wrongdoing often fear to seek help, feeling concerned that admission of the wrong will immediately start the wheels of the judicial machinery to work. The footnote reads, contrast this with James 5 and verse 16, where the disciple does not limit confession as to be made to men in authority, but says, confess your sins to one another and pray for one another so that you may be healed. A letter to the governing body from the Watchtower's British branch quotes the organization's policy that all serious sins require reporting to the body of elders and are not to be handled by any single elder or kept confidential by him. Footnote reads, letter dated May 3, 1979, signed by W. Gooch, then the branch coordinator. It then gives an actual case where a sister of irreproachable character, of fine reputation in the congregation, the wife of an unbelieving man who shows her little love, committed adultery on one occasion with a non-witness man. The next day, greatly distressed, she went to an elder and confessed her wrong. The branch's letter relates, quote, the elder, a compassionate man, Knowing the sister well over some years, realized that she was not a hardened sinner, that she had already reproved herself and simply needed encouragement and help to recover her spiritual equilibrium and good relationship with Jehovah. He prayed with her, counseled her, and arranged to give her continued help to make sure she would neither fall again into sin nor be swallowed up with remorse. The elder, however, felt an organizational obligation to report the matter to the presiding overseer. The result? Quote, "Unfortunately, this brother, the presiding overseer, took offense at the elder's handling of the matter in this way and made it known to the body of elders, and it has become a bone of contention among them as to whether the elder was right or wrong. We might say, in this particular instance, the sister has recovered herself and is doing well in Jehovah's service." The real issue for these elders was not whether a straying sheep had been helped to recover, it was whether organizational policy had been adhered to. The fact is that it had not, and though the results of the elder's actions were obviously good, he was nonetheless out of order from the organizational standpoint. He felt that for the sister to be brought before a committee would seriously and unnecessarily damage her reputation. But organizational policy did not provide for letting such concerns determine his action. The British branch coordinator goes on to say, quote, "There is no doubt that many who have been in the same position as the sister have held back from confessing their sin to an elder out of knowledge that their subsequent meeting with the judicial committee would leak out and be public knowledge and ruin a previously impeccable reputation. This holding back on their part has been to their spiritual hurt. Is it not better if such fine people, who make a single mistake, might know that they can have the matter handled privately? Would it not encourage them to come forward and confess their wrong and receive the help they need? Some might say that this would encourage people in sin, believing that they can have it handled quietly, as in the confessional, and then sin again. But that argument cannot be sustained. If they have a bent to sin and repeat it, they know it will be handled by a judicial committee. So, our question is really asking whether each elder can make his own decision whether to handle such matters, including immorality, privately himself, or to report it to the body of elders for investigation. The British branch coordinator's reasoning was sound, compassionate, as well as revealing in regard to the actual damaging restraint caused by the organizational policy. But the governing body left the policy unchanged. A traditional view controlled. The footnote reads, "The 1983 Organization Manual Organized to Accomplish Our Ministry, page 145, says, quote, elders may be approached by individuals who either confess their own sins or report what they know regarding the wrongdoing of others. James 5:16, Leviticus 5:1. But regardless of the exact manner in which the elders first hear reports of serious wrongdoing on the part of a baptized member of the congregation, an initial investigation will be made." Back to the paragraph. Since the organization's policies enter into virtually all fields of conduct, elders also feel authorized, at times even obligated, to involve themselves in any aspect of the lives of others in a congregation, with or without invitation. This produces a situation where the right of witness parents to discipline and restore their children as they judge best is often subject to preemptive, even arbitrary control and determination by elders. Parents do not feel free to make their own decision as to whether they wish to invite outside assistance or not. They are caused to feel duty-bound to report instances of wrongdoing within their families to elders. The elders decide whether they think the parents have the situation in hand. Otherwise, they act as a judicial court in the matter. The footnote reads, see the Watchtower of November 15th, 1988, page 20. There often is a similar interposing of judicial authority within the marital relationship. The footnote reads, see Crisis of Conscience, pages 47 to 54, and the Watchtower of March 15th, 1983, pages 30 and 31. Furthermore, The evidence indicates that with distressing frequency, their intervention is not from an approach of offering help and healing, but in the capacity of appointed authorities with almost unlimited warrant to investigate, interrogate, and subpoena testimony. Footnote reads, in cases where a person is suspected of disagreement with the organization, he may be interrogated about the things he reads, the persons he speaks to, the letters he receives, virtually nothing being viewed as off-limits for his interrogators. Failure to answer all questions creates jeopardy for the person. Back to the paragraph. All too often, the aim of initial questioning, generally done by two elders, appears to be to determine whether the evidence provides basis for indictment, thereby obligating the wrongdoer to submit to a judicial hearing before a religious court or judicial committee of 3 elders, a hearing that is essentially secret, not open to any persons other than those admitted by the judicial committee. While this might be viewed as expressing compassionate concern for the privacy of the accused wrongdoer, his or her wishes are simply not a factor. Even if the accused wishes and requests that the matter be heard in an open way so that all may witness the evidence, this is not permitted by the policies of the organization. As discussed, efforts at reform or readjustment to save the person generally do not go beyond the holding of 1 or 2 meetings with him or her. As a sort of universal remedy, elders usually prescribe increased field service and meeting attendance, and if the person does not follow this prescription, this is viewed as evidence of an unrepentant attitude. Rarely is any enduring long-term program of personal help offered or supplied. If adjudged guilty and of not having demonstrated sufficient evidence of repentance, the judgment of the committee, whether for disfellowshipping or a less drastic action for the persons being publicly reproved, is announced to the congregation without the congregations knowing the actual grounds for the decision. If disfellowshipped, the individual now is viewed as in a disfellowshipped state. It is no longer a question of what he is actually doing or the life he is living, but what his category or status is. He can only exit from that status by following the prescribed procedure of the organization. The decision as to whether to declare his disfellowshipped state as ended or not rests entirely with a judicial committee of elders. Thus, a young man of 16 may be disfellowshipped for some act of sexual immorality. He may not choose to go through the necessary steps for reinstatement and the ending of his disfellowship status. However, he may no longer engage in sexual immorality, may later marry, father children, show himself to be a faithful husband, a good father, and an honest, responsible person, seeking to live by Christian principles. Yet, no matter how many years may have passed or what kind of person he shows himself to be, he is to be treated the same as if he were a sexually immoral person, a corrupting influence, a person with whom other Christians, even his family members, should not associate. Why? Because he has not taken the legal steps ordained by the organization for having the disfellowshipped state lifted and being officially declared fit for association. If the father in the parable of the prodigal son had lived by such policies, then, upon seeing his wayward son approaching the home, rather than running out and embracing him as he did, he would instead have had to insist that the son first be screened by a committee of 3 to determine whether the father could properly express such parental interest and affection. The footnote reads, Luke 15:11-24. For many years, it was viewed as improper to pray for disfellowshipped persons. The Branch Committee in Great Britain, in a letter dated May 3, 1979, referred to the parable of the prodigal son when inquiring of the governing body about this policy, citing the case of the faithful sister whose son, disfellowshipped 14 years ago for fornication, is now married with 2 children and is no longer a fornicator, and expressing how difficult it was to tell the sister it was wrong to pray for her son, that is, pray for his return to the organization. The policy changed. See the Watchtower of October 15, 1979, page 31, and December 1st, pages 30 and 31. The woman could now pray for her son, yet his disfellowship status and the label going with it remained. More recent watchtowers have emphatically stressed avoidance by relatives of association with any such disfellowshipped ones, not because they are now wrongdoers, but because they have not gone through the organization's procedure for reinstatement. Back to the paragraph. In this way, adult and mature Christians are denied any right to exercise their own intelligence and judgment as to whether a person is a clean living person or not, whether they could properly invite him or her into their home or not. The religious authority must first rule on this, and if the authority does not lift the disfellowshipped label, the person must remain as taboo. At the Brooklyn headquarters, as also at branch offices in the various countries, files have been maintained recording all disfellowshipping actions. Not only the names of those disfellowshipped, but also the correspondence containing some details of the action has generally been retained. It may have been retained for a considerable time, many years, even after an individual has been reinstated. For some strange reason, even when a person listed dies, the practice at the Brooklyn headquarters was to retain the record of his or her having been disfellowshipped. The footnote reads, "In the pre-computer times, orange-colored disfellowshipped cards were used for the file on disfellowshipped persons. John Mitchell, who worked in the service department as well as in secretarial work in the executive offices, relates that after such cards were stamped with the word deceased, they were then put back in the file. He quotes a fellow worker, Lee Waters, as observing, 'We must be the only organization which keeps records like this for dead people.'" Back to the paragraph. In 1973, a witness wrote to the headquarters stating that on a tour of the Brooklyn facilities, the tour guide had pointed out a file cabinet marked confidential and explained that it contained the records of those disfellowshipped. This man had been disfellowshipped some 16 years before and had been reinstated only 7 months after disfellowshipment. The briefness of the period was because of the minor nature of the problem. In his letter, he stated that the other elders later told him that they thought the disfellowshipping action was taken only because the society was stressing loyalty to the organization. 4 months after being disfellowshipped and before his reinstatement, he had been drafted for military service and had been willing to face imprisonment by refusing. In his letter, he wrote that he found it disturbing to think that, in addition to the inner suffering he had experienced as a result of the disfellowshipping, he was now confronted with the probability that his name was on a confidential file. He said that, quote, "Having a mark against one on a permanent file, like a police file at the precinct, seems to me highly irregular." In his word, God mercifully invites those sinning to reconcile with Him and assures them that, though their sins be as scarlet, quote, "they will be made white just like snow," and says, "I shall forgive their error, and their sin I shall remember no more." The footnote references Isaiah chapter 1, verse 18, and Jeremiah 31, verse 34. As seen, by contrast, the Watchtower organization carefully maintains voluminous files containing a vast amount of embarrassing information. The footnote reads, in his November 18, 1971 letter to President Knorr, Headquarters Writing Department Overseer Carl Adams questioned the keeping of these files even after the individual was reinstated. He commented, quote, "At the present time, the names of even those reinstated are kept in the file, and bulky records are kept of their cases, labeled 'Do Not Destroy.' It seems tantamount to saying, 'We believe you are forgiven, but we are keeping a record of your sin.' Or like saying, 'Your sins are washed clean, but we are storing the dirt in a jar with your name on the label.'" Decades later, the practice still continued. A course unsupported by biblical precedent. There is nothing to show that the legalistic approach and circumstance so strongly present in the witness organization was ever ordained among God's people, either in pre-Christian or in Christian times. In praising the provision in the U.S. Constitution for an accused person to, quote, enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial, to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation, and to be confronted with the witness against him, the Await magazine of January 22, 1981, page 17, went on to demonstrate that justice in the nation of Israel employed these same principles, stating, quote, since the local court was situated at the city gates, there was no question about the trial being public. Deuteronomy 16:18-20. No doubt the public trials helped influence the judges toward carefulness and justice, qualities that sometimes vanish in secret star chamber hearings. What about witnesses? Witnesses in Bible times were required to testify publicly. For this reason, they were warned not to be influenced in their testimony by the pressure of public opinion, so as to turn aside with the crowd in order to pervert justice. Although inconvenient, the Watchtower organization frequently goes back to Mosaic law and law procedures for support for its policies. It acts exactly contrary to the principles here presented. Though it praises the influence toward carefulness and justice that public hearings produce, the reality is that all witness judicial committee hearings are, by organizational policy, held precisely in the form of secret star chamber hearings, with the result that the committee is, in effect, answerable only to itself. The validity of its announced decisions must be accepted purely on faith by the congregation. Unlike the congregation members in Corinth, who knew clearly what the reason and circumstances were that motivated Paul to urge them to cease association with the individual in question, congregation members today are left in the dark. Supposition, conjecture, and gossip often fill the vacuum produced by the secrecy of the committee's actions. As someone has put it, trying to squash a rumor is like trying to unring a bell. And, once unleashed, the gossip spawned by these secret hearings can bring lasting, as well as unjust, damage to the individual's reputation. In pre-Christian times, the scriptural evidence is that the elders of a city or town basically served in a judicial capacity when requested to do so by one who claimed to be aggrieved, thus primarily in the settling of controversies, with major and difficult cases going before the temple priesthood, or later before the king as Jehovah's representatives. Compare Exodus chapter 18, verses 13 through 16, Deuteronomy 17, 8 and 9, and Deuteronomy 25, verse 1. 2 Samuel 14, 4 through 7, and 2 Samuel 15, 2 through 6. Also 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 16 through 22, Isaiah chapter 10, verse 1 and 2, and Ruth chapter 4, 1 through 13. There was little to show that the village elders initiated action unilaterally as investigators and prosecutors, other than in the case of crimes of great seriousness, as, for example, in crimes involving bloodshed or the worship of false gods. Deuteronomy 17, 2 through 5, and Deuteronomy 21, 1 through 9. The text of Deuteronomy 21, 18 through 21, is often used to justify intervention by witness elders in cases of wrongdoing by children. In reality, it demonstrates that matters were essentially left to the parents to decide and handle, for the parents described in the text had clearly exhausted their own efforts at correction and reform. They only turned the matter over to the city elders when forced to the conclusion that their son, one who quite evidently had attained a fair age, was an extreme case, showing himself to be an incorrigible rebel, glutton, or drunkard. Christians, of course, are not subject to the law system of Israel, though its underlying principles serve as guidance to them. Our reading of the Christian scriptures clearly shows that the apostles and other writers emphasized not intense, scrupulous law enforcement, but the building up of fellow believers in love and faith through teaching, exhortation, reproof, encouragement, and above all, by example as the means for attaining moral and ethical cleanness among Christians. The ceasing of fellowship with persons pursuing a sinful course was not the result of some formalized judicial procedure at edict. It called for voluntary congregational response on a personal level, not action resulting from having a judicial edict imposed on the members as a collective body. While, when circumstances required, congregational members were urged to withdraw fellowship for the good of the congregation and its name, and with the additional hope that the wrongdoer might be shamed into leaving his course, we may note the apostle's expression to the Corinthian Christians that, quote, the rebuke given by the majority of the congregation was sufficient, and that the men should now be forgiven by them, not reinstated by some committee. 2 Corinthians chapter 2, 6 through 8. By contrast, Watchtower policy causes any members who fail to observe an official proscription of association with a disfellowshipped individual to be disfellowshipped themselves. Yet, Paul says nothing about taking such an action toward the minority who chose not to share in the rebuke given to the particular wrongdoer referred to in his letter. Shunning. At Matthew 18, 15 through 19, Jesus gave instruction regarding the settling of faults between persons, saying, quote, moreover, if your brother commits a sin, go lay bare his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take along with you one or two more, in order that at the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every matter may be established. If he does not listen to them, speak to the congregation. If he does not listen to the congregation, let him be to you just as a man of the nations and as a tax collector. The Watchtower organization focuses on the last phrase, let him be to you just as a man of the nations and as a tax collector, as support for a very extreme attitude toward any officially excommunicated. Footnote reads, in this, as in several of the following sections, I have been assisted by the research done by others as to points at issue. The September 15, 1981 Watchtower draws heavily on historical material about traditional Pharisaic behavior toward such persons in Jesus' day, and then imposes this as a pattern for its modern policy. The Jews then had a shoving system involving stages of punishment, described by 3 terms. 1, nidoi, for the first offense. This forbade sharing of the bath, the razor, the convivial table, and it restricted social intercourse and the frequenting of the temple. It lasted for 30, 60, or 90 days. 2, if the offender still remained obstinate, the curse herem was formally pronounced upon him by the council, 10 men, and he was shut out from the intellectual, religious, and social life of the community, completely severed from the congregation. 3, shamatha is probably a general term applied to both midilei and herem. It evidently is what is pointed to in the references to persons being put out of the synagogue, as at John 9, verse 22, John 12, 42, and John 16, verse 2. Footnote reads, The International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, Volume 2, page 1050. Jesus may have referred to these different stages when saying of his followers that people would separate you from their company and reproach you, from the Greek onizidu, corresponding to the Hebrew herem, or malediction, and cast out your name as evil. Luke chapter 6, verse 22. This Jewish procedure reminds one of the Watchtower policies, which, while not necessarily parallel, partake of the same formalistic approach, with its varying stages of 1. Marking, applied to persons who, although not known to be guilty of grave sin, are viewed as displaying flagrant disregard for theocratic order. Such a person is to be admonished first, and if he continues his course, then a talk is to be given to the congregation about his type of conduct, and members are called upon to mark any person practicing such conduct. He is not completely shunned, but members are to limit social fellowship with him. The footnote reads, see Organized to Accomplish Our Ministry, pages 152 and 153, and The Watchtower of April 15, 1985, pages 30 and 31. I believe there is no question that the distinction between this and full shunning is quite nebulous for most witnesses, and the Watchtower discussion does little to remove the confusion. As discussed later, its explanation of the key text of 2 Thessalonians 3:14 and 15 contains a serious error. 2. Reproof, linked with a probationary period. This involves sins viewed as more serious than those simply allowing for marking. Though such sins as fornication, drunkenness, and theft are always sufficient to merit official reproof, in other areas the distinction often is not clear and depends largely on the view of the particular elders handling the matter. The reproof may be private reproof, or it may be reproof before all onlookers, the onlookers being those who give testimony at the religious court hearing, or, if the matter is deemed of general knowledge, reproof before the entire congregation. If he is to be officially reproved before the congregation, this must be done at a weekly service meeting, and the announcement may be followed later by a talk discussing the type of sin involved. Restrictions may be applied, such as not sharing and conducting any parts in meetings, not representing the congregation in prayer, reading scriptures, or even commenting in meetings. The footnote reads, "See Organized to Accomplish Our Ministry," pages 145 and 146. The Watchtower, September 1st, 1981, pages 23 through 27. This can apply not only to baptized witnesses, but to others who, after examination by two elders, are announced to the congregation as accepted unbaptized publishers, previously called approved associates, who are now qualified to report field service time. See The Watchtower, November 15th, 1988, pages 16 through 19, where the organizational procedures involved in these cases are spelled out in great detail. Back to the paragraph. The person is not officially labeled as to be shunned, but invariably he or she experiences cruel treatment and a reduction of social acceptance, and is almost certain to be the subject of negative talk and conjecture, the actual facts of the case being known only to the elders. Length of the probation period is determined by the elders acting in their judicial capacity. 3. Disfellowshipping, which brings total rejection, a complete cutting off. Other members are not even to speak to disfellowshipped ones. Viewed against the background of the Jewish practices in effect in Jesus' day, we see not simply a similar emphasis on prescribed procedure, but the expression of a similar legalistic spirit, which is most notable. The Scriptures, rather than advocating the existing Jewish system, showed that its effects were terroristic, instilling strong fear of authority. Instead of improving people's character by discipline, it actually had a corrupting, debilitating effect on them. The Apostle John, who wrote that love throws fear outside, is most notable in revealing how this shunning system exerted a damaging effect on the consciences of the Jewish people, hindering their expression of faith and even leading as far as their denying the Messiah. See John chapter 7, verse 13, John chapter 9, verse 22, chapter 12, verse 42 and 43, chapter 19, verse 38, and chapter 20, verse 19. Also 1 John chapter 4, verse 18. Typifying the intimidation felt, Nicodemus, though believing Jesus to have come from God, nevertheless waited till the night to visit him incognito. Jesus told him that, quote, "He that does what is true comes to the light," rather than seeking the protective cover of darkness to avoid detection of what he really believes at heart. John 3, 1 and 2 and 21. I have had similar communications today, with people even taking out a special post office box in order to correspond, all the while using a pseudonym to protect their identity. One young man, who said his father is a prominent elder, phoned me and had only spoken a sentence or two. Then he asked, "You're not taping this conversation, are you?" I assured him that I did not do that. He continued, "You don't have computer equipment to trace my number?" I laughed and said, "No, I don't. And if I did have, I wouldn't use it." He said he was sure I realized what a risk he was taking in phoning me, and that if his wife came in, he would have to hang up immediately. Not long into the conversation, he did bring it to a quick close. The next day, he phoned again and said, "I guess I sounded a bit paranoid." I replied, "Yes, you did, but I understand why." He has communicated over a period of many months, and I still do not know his name, nor have I made any effort to learn it. The fear is almost palpable, and it has the same origin as the fear affecting Nicodemus and others of his day: fear of discovery and punitive action by religious authority. In his words at Matthew 18:15 through 19, Jesus does not set forth a prescription for organizational excommunication. The wording indicates an offense and a penalty of purely personal nature. The footnote reads, some translations, following certain ancient manuscripts, read at verse 15, quote, "If your brother sins against you." See NIV, NRSV, TEV, LB, and NEB footnote. Even after referring to the congregation, evidently meaning the operating Jewish congregation, for there was no Christian congregation as yet, Jesus said, "Let him be to you," singular, "as a Gentile or tax collector." The footnote reads, whereas in English, you can refer either to one person or several persons, Greek has separate forms to indicate singular or plural application. Back to the paragraph. Rather than an ecclesiastical action imposed on an entire congregation, there is simply a principle given providing for the wronged one's dignified, personal avoidance of an obstinate offender. The context preceding and following these verses also points to this. Whereas verses 17 and 18 of this section are portrayed as implying action by ecclesiastical authority, the verses following indicate otherwise. As few as two persons can arrive at a decision on religious matters and can have God's blessing in their doing so. See verse 19. That blessing is not dependent on the decision reachers being individuals holding some official position, nor on their decisions being submitted to some centralized authority structure. The reason is that Jesus promises, verse 20, to be in their midst, guiding their thoughts, even as he does in all other cases of true Christian efforts. And this is what produces agreement and genuine unity, irrespective of numbers. His Father is over all and through all, not just in some, in cultivating the unity of the Spirit. The footnote references Ephesians 4, 3 through 6. Christ prayed for their unity, knowing that even his mighty personal earthly influence could not of itself maintain this, and that their peace could come only as a fruit of God's Spirit. John 17, 16 through 21, and Galatians 5, 22. It was not to be a peace imposed by authoritarian control. At verse 6 of Matthew chapter 18, Jesus warned against putting a stumbling block before one of these little ones who believes in me. Belief in him is the criteria, not acceptance of an organization's doctrinal ecclesiastical package. Their personal relationship with the Father is stressed, verse 10, and the parable of the strayed sheep and the shepherd's deep concern for that one sheep is related, verses 12 through 14. The evidence is that by its dogmatism, its authoritarian demands, and unremitting grip on their thinking, beliefs, and conscience, the witness organization does indeed stumble many persons. Worse, having done so, it then abandons them after what amounts to only token efforts at remedying the problem. Yet they are among those little ones of whom Christ said, "They believe in me." Just as one instance among many to illustrate how the Spirit produced causes, or at the very least allows elders to feel justified in taking harsh measures toward little ones, there is the case of a young couple living in a Midwestern state and engaged to be married. The young man lived by himself in an apartment. The young woman lived with her mother and stepfather. Both of their mothers had become witnesses, and they convinced the couple to study with Jehovah's Witnesses, as this would get their future marriage off to a good start. They began studies with the couple serving as pioneers in the area, the husband studying with the young man, the wife with the young woman. The young persons showed real desire to gain knowledge of God's will, and after a few months began attending some of the witness meetings. The wife of the pioneer couple studying with them then relates what happened. Quote, "One Friday, my husband received a call from the young man saying he had a problem and asking would we please come over. When we arrived at his apartment, the young woman was also there. She explained that the night before, her stepfather had thrown her out of the house. Having nowhere else to go at that late hour, she had gone to her fiancé's apartment, and, concerned to do the right thing, he gave her his bedroom and slept on the sofa. Their call was because they wanted to find a place immediately for her to stay. My husband and I volunteered to let her stay with us until she could either resolve things with her stepfather or find another place to stay. She was to come to our house that evening. As we drove away, my husband told me that even though he felt fine about the arrangement, he nevertheless wanted to clear it with the congregation elders first. I said I could not understand why we needed the elders' okay to have a house guest, particularly with my husband as the head of the house. Still, he was determined to talk with the elders before the young woman's arrival at our house, saying that he wanted the elders to know that he was submissive to the organization. That evening, he met with 2 elders, and after a long private discussion, was told that under no circumstances should we allow the young woman into our house. I was shocked, and my husband seemed quite surprised as well. We arrived home after 9:30 p.m. and learned that the young woman had been waiting for us for hours, but had left. My husband phoned her and informed her that the elders did not want her to stay with us and that our offer thus had to be canceled. The young couple did not know what to do and decided she would have to spend yet another night at the apartment. The next morning at 9 a.m., 2 elders knocked at the apartment door and were invited in. The young couple said that at first they were delighted that someone was coming to help them. The elders, however, simply asked if it was true that the young woman had spent 2 nights in the apartment. The couple said it was true and tried to explain why. The elders replied that that was all they needed to know and told them in view of what had happened that they had no other choice than to formally disassociate the couple the next day at the Sunday meeting. There was presumption of guilt beyond what the elders had been told. We arrived shortly after the elders left and found the couple depressed and disillusioned. I could not believe that such action was necessary in view of the circumstances, particularly with people who had just been studying 3 months and had only attended a few meetings. When my husband contacted the elders, they informed him that they could properly disassociate anyone as long as the person had attended even 1 meeting. Sunday, with the couple's mothers and 2 sisters present, the formal announcement of their disassociation was read and the audience told that they were not to be associated with. The young couple were now split off from their families. My husband made an appointment a few days later to speak with a circuit overseer. Seemingly very empathetic, the man, however, told us that while he wished he had known before the announcement was made, now that it was made, there was nothing that could be done about it, that the society did not want to publicly override local elders. The young couple said they felt that whatever they now did, they were condemned anyway. They began living together, after a few months married, had children, eventually got divorced. I cannot help but wonder if, had they not been subject to public embarrassment and alienated from their respective families at that early point in their young lives, whether life's road would have been smoother for them. Regardless of whether their lives would have been different or not, the manner in which they were dealt with certainly displayed little of love, mercy, or compassion. This action took place previous to the November 15, 1988 Watchtower and its ruling that unbaptized persons engaged in wrongdoing are not to be officially pronounced or treated as disfellowshipped persons. Perhaps under the new ruling, the elders might have acted differently. This, however, simply underscores the wrongness of the imposition of organizationally formulated rules that override individual conscience, that restrict men from expressing the compassion and mercy as well as sensible judgment they might otherwise normally express. The damage done by such rules is, in many cases, irreversible. It may be noted as well that the watchtower referred to states that if investigating elders decide the unbaptized committer of some wrong no longer qualifies as a publisher, then, quote, a simple announcement will be made at an appropriate time, saying such and such is no longer a publisher of the good news. This is not a formal disfellowshipping announcement, yet the results would, in all probability, be much the same. While saying that, even in this case, witnesses are not required to avoid speaking with such a one, the watchtower adds the caveat that, despite this adjustment, the counsel at 1 Corinthians 15:33 should still be observed. The footnote reads, The Watchtower, November 15, 1988, page 19, and footnote. Reference to this text regarding bad associations that spoil useful habits would almost certainly cause the majority of witnesses to feel constrained to grant anything beyond cool acknowledgement to such an unbaptized person. Virtually none would feel that the readjusted organizational policy would allow them to visit with or spend time in seeking to build up the individual spiritually. If they were to do so, they would undoubtedly be spoken to reprovingly by the elders. Such adjustments in policy, spelled out in legalistic terms and technical distinctions, rarely produce a change in the spirit developed by the organization. And it is that spirit and mindset that lie at the base of so much of the unkindness and lack of compassion manifest. Whose example? Jesus' words as to an individual's viewing a recalcitrant offender as a man of the nations and as a tax collector supply no justification for the attitude of cold disdain and extreme aversion the Watchtower organization inspires towards those it disfellowships. The Scriptures give us two examples between which to choose. The Watchtower, both in the September 15, 1981 issue earlier referred to, and in a more recent April 15, 1991 issue, stresses the example of Jewish religious leaders of Christ's day. These view Gentiles and tax collectors with deep prejudice and scorn. The articles speak of such ones as being despised and even hated. In great contrast, the Hebrew Scriptures had for centuries urged a very different attitude. Israelites were to love the alien, for they had once been aliens themselves. The footnote reads, see Deuteronomy 10, verse 19, and chapter 24, verses 14 and 15. Exodus 23, verse 9. The Kenites were considered almost brothers of the Israelites, and Rechabites, Jebusites, Hittites, and others of foreign races were accepted with favor. Judges 1:16, Judges 5:24, 2 Samuel 11, 6 through 11, 2 Samuel 15, 19 through 22, chapter 18, verse 2, and chapter 24, verses 15 through 25. Also Jeremiah 35, 1 through 19. Back to the paragraph. Gentiles had the right of asylum, occasionally even had Israelite servants, could offer prayer at the temple, and the Israelites are shown as having prayed on behalf of Gentile rulers. The footnote references Numbers 35, verse 15, Leviticus chapter 25, 47, 1 Kings 8, 41 through 43, Jeremiah 29, verses 1 and 7, and compare Ezra chapter 6, verse 10. The attitude of the Jews underwent a corrupting change over the centuries, the reason doubtless being the terrible treatment they suffered at the hand of Gentile captors during exile. They apparently took scriptures relating to Israel's entrance into Canaan and demands for avoiding idolatrous contamination as basis for categorizing all Gentiles as, by nature, enemies of God and of his people. Footnote reads, see, for example, Leviticus 18, 24 through 30, Deuteronomy 7, 3 through 12, and Ezra 9, 11 and 12. By New Testament times, Gentiles were viewed with extreme aversion, even near hatred, and counted as unclean, it now being deemed unlawful to have friendly intercourse with them. Even when they became proselytes, they were not admitted, as in old times, to full fellowship. These prevailing prejudices are reflected in the accounts found at John 18, verse 28, Acts chapter 10, verse 28, and chapter 11, verse 3, Galatians chapter 2, verse 12. God's Son was not bound by these and similar social norms, and was criticized by the religious authority for the very reason that he did not conform to them. The footnote references Matthew chapter 9, verse 10 and 11, and also chapter 11, verse 19. He knew his Father's will and his love for all mankind, of whatever race, and Jesus set a higher standard for us to follow. The footnote references John 3:16, Acts chapter 10, verse 28 and 34. He showed this in his behavior toward both Gentiles and tax collectors, viewed as despised agents of the Gentile government, toward Samaritans and sinners. The footnote references Matthew chapter 5, verse 43 to 48, Matthew chapter 8, verse 8 through 13. Compare Luke chapter 7, 2 through 9, Matthew chapter 9, verses 10 through 13, chapter 11, verse 19, chapter 15, 21 through 28. Compare Mark chapter 7, 24 through 30, Luke chapter 5, 29 and 30, chapter 15, verses 1 and 2, and John chapter 4, 7 through 42. The Watchtower organization would set this example aside in its shunning positions, claiming that Jesus associated with such ones only due to their previous evidence of receptiveness to the good news, saying that this was not a pattern of how unrepentant sinners were to be treated. Footnote references the Watchtower of September 15th, 1981, page 19, and also April 15th, 1991, pages 20 and 21. They ignore the fact that it was not before, but after receiving Jesus' help that repentance came. Many were sinners, even prostitutes, at the time of Jesus associating with them, talking with them. As he said, I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners. Matthew chapter 9, 11 through 13, New Revised Standard Version. These were not members in good standing in the Jewish congregation, nor were they prospective proselytes to the Jewish congregation, like those whom Jehovah's Witnesses would term newly interested ones, whose faulty conduct they may overlook for a time. They were for the most part already in the Jewish community, the covenant people of God, probably from birth onward, but their conduct made them marked persons, sometimes virtual outcasts. And those so marking them were the elders of the Jewish community. For one of Jehovah's Witnesses to talk with and associate with people in comparable relationship to the witness community would mean to risk disfellowshipment for violating the organization's shunning norms. For someone in the witness community to imitate Jesus' conduct would mean to spend time contacting and talking not only with those who had moved away from observing the organizational norms and from association, but even with some who were outcasts, having fallen into sinful practices, and to seek to be a positive, healing force for them. The organization's policies rule against such a course. Once the disfellowship label is applied to a person, even his family members are to cut off any spiritual discussion with him. The footnote reads, the only exception to this is in the case of a disfellowshipped minor child living in the home, the organization granting to the parents the right to continue giving spiritual instruction to the child. The Watchtower, November 15th, 1988, pages 19 and 20. Older disfellowshipped relatives living in the home are allowed to be present when spiritual material is considered as a family. The Watchtower, April 15th, 1991, page 22, footnote. This presumably would even include a wife or grandparent living in the home, the implication being that they are allowed to be present but not to share in the discussion. For many decades, even elders were not to speak to disfellowshipped persons unless the individual approached them petitioning for a lifting of his or her disfellowship status. Footnote reads, in a 1971 letter to President Knorr, Carl Adams reminded him of his relating an incident involving Price Hughes, who at one time was the branch overseer for the British Isles. Carl wrote, quote, "You related his happening to meet a disfellowshipped person, and that he told you he had spoken very straightforwardly to the man, telling him what he ought to do to be restored. As I recall, he said that he did it because it seemed the right thing to do, although he described the event in an apologetic manner because of knowing he had not followed the Society's policy." Elders were to understand that they should never initiate any dialogue, that this must always be on the part of the disfellowshipped one. All of this, despite the abundant evidence in Scripture that, by means of his appointed prophets, God himself had regularly initiated communication with those in Israel who had taken up an extremely sinful, even stubbornly rebellious course, appealing to them to turn from wrong ways they had engaged in, not momentarily, but for years. The footnote reads, compare Isaiah chapter 1, verse 2 through 6, verse 14 through 20, and chapter 44, verse 21 and 22, Jeremiah chapter 3, 12 through 14, and chapter 5, 20 through 25, Ezekiel 18, 30 through 32. The majority of the Hebrew prophecies were addressed to a nation deep in a sinful state. Add to this the fact that God recommends his own love to us in that, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us when we were enemies. Romans 5, 8 through 10. After about half a century, the Watchtower of April 15, 1991, finally acknowledged this, and the propriety of initiating communication with disfellowshipped persons. Regrettably, it immediately proceeded to systematize the matter, limiting to the elders any such initiation of contact, spelling out in detail the rules by which any imitating of God's mercy must be expressed. The magazine's first article presents many fine examples and scriptural principles demonstrating mercy. The second article proceeds to tell members just how they should apply these examples and principles, admittedly the crucial factor. One can almost visualize the influence of organizational authority of the article's writer in the transition that is made from Scripture to organizational policy. The second article quickly begins laying a foundation for limiting this merciful initiation of contact just to organizationally appointed elders. Preceding a quotation of Matthew 18, 15 through 17, it says that these words were stated to Jesus' apostles, quote, who would later be Christian overseers. This, despite the fact that the matter of overseership does not even enter into the counsel Jesus there gave, and his counsel is clearly intended for all Christians. After several paragraphs focusing on elders, the April 15, 1991 Watchtower, page 22, then says, quote, the encyclopedia quoted earlier said, this basic rationale for excommunication was to protect the standards of the group. A little leaven ferments the whole lump. The motive is clear in most biblical and extra-canonical passages, but concern for the individual, even after expulsion, was the basis of Paul's plea in 2 Corinthians 2, 7 through 10. Hence, concern of this kind should logically be shown today by the shepherds of the flock. Acts 20, 28, 1 Peter 5 and 2. Former friends and relatives might hope that a disfellowshipped one would return, yet out of respect for the command at 1 Corinthians 5 and 11, they do not associate with an expelled person. They leave it to the appointed shepherds to take the initiative to see if such a one is interested in returning. Nowhere do the Scriptures themselves place elders in a privileged relationship, restricting to them exclusively such things as encouraging, reproving, or seeking to restore persons who have taken a wrong course. That they may take the lead in so doing does not in any way mean that others are prohibited from doing the same things. To make such rulings reveals a clergy-laity mentality, not that of a Christian brotherhood. It sets two standards of conduct, one for elders, a different one for all others. The exhortation to be imitators of God as beloved children is directed to all Christians, not just a select number thereof. Footnote references Ephesians chapter 5, verse 1. Of all things, surely the example God has set us of compassion and mercy is to be followed freely by all Christians, without their being hemmed in with organizational restrictions designed to promote ecclesiastical authority. Compare Galatians 5:22 and 23. The material goes yet farther and systematizes even the elders' expression of mercy toward disfellowshipped and disassociated ones. It provides that, quote, once a year at most, the body of elders should consider whether there are such persons deemed worthy of initiation of contact living in their territory. The elders would focus on those who have been expelled for over a year. The footnote reads, Watchtower, April 15, 1991, page 23. A footnote reminds those not of the elder class that if they should learn of a disfellowshipped person living in their territory, they should give that information to the elders. It is typical of the Watchtower organization that such a mechanistic approach is applied to an expression that by its very nature should be spontaneous and freely made, namely, the expression of mercy. Can anyone imagine a shepherd operating under such rules? Once a year, considering whether he should seek out a lost sheep and limiting the search only to sheep who had been out of a flock for a year? How utterly unlike their Heavenly Father's remarkable expression of mercy and long-suffering. To wrongdoers and even idolaters in Judah, he said, quote, I myself have spoken to you persistently, untiringly and insistently, MAB, and you have not obeyed me. I have sent to you all my servants the prophets, sending them persistently, saying, Turn now, every one of you, from your evil way, and amend your doings, and do not go after other gods to serve them, and then you shall live in the land that I gave to you and your ancestors. Footnote references Jeremiah 35, verse 14 and 15, New Revised Standard Version. Compare Jeremiah chapter 7, 24 and 25. The article then proceeds to spell out how elders' visits to such ones should be carried out, the procedural steps to be followed, and, quote, what those of us who are not overseers and will not be taking such initiative towards disfellowshipped persons should do. It goes into considerable detail as to how witnesses should view and relate to families where one member living in the home is disfellowshipped, that they should not be like the ancient Jews whose hatred was extended even to the family of the tax collector. How to react if that person, quote, does not have the courtesy to keep away from visitors. What to say if that one answers when a witness visits the home or telephones. The footnote reads, The Watchtower, April 15th, 1991, pages 23 and 24. All the fine counsel from Scripture the articles begin with is thus promptly overprinted with organizational policy that systematizes, codifies, and in effect desiccates and vitiates the generous principles and examples of mercy given by God. Not even a hello to them. Aside from whatever once-a-year contact elders may make with certain disfellowshipped or disassociated persons, the treatment of such ones otherwise remains the same. All witnesses not of the elder class are to avoid any association or communication with those in the disfellowshipped state. While certain concession is made for a disfellowshipped family member residing within the family home, any relatives living outside are to be communicated with only when there is a family matter requiring this or some urgent need. The extreme rigidity of the policies is modeled on the harsh position taken by the religious leaders of Jesus' day. The Watchtower of September 15, 1981, page 21, quoted as corroboration of its policy this account of the treatment accorded those put out of the synagogues. Quote, "Henceforth he was like one dead. He was not allowed to study with others. No social intercourse was to be held with him. He was not even to be shown the road. He might, indeed, buy the necessities of life, but was forbidden to eat or drink with such a one." The footnote reads, quoted by the Watchtower from The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah by A. Edersheim, Volume 2, page 184. Note that this was not, as in the case of Paul's exhortation to Corinthian Christians, a matter of personal decision, but synagogue members were forbidden by religious authority to act otherwise toward those expelled from the synagogue. This Jewish practice finds precise parallel in the treatment accorded any person on whom the Watchtower organization, by its appointed elders, places the disfellowshipped label. He or she is viewed as one dead. The particular reason for the action is completely immaterial. It might have been for killing roaches on an army base, doing lawn work for a church, or simply having a birthday celebration. Or it might have been for acknowledging inability to accept 1914 as a date marked by the Bible, or that only certain persons should partake at the memorial celebration of Christ's death. In my own case, it was for eating a meal in a restaurant with my employer, who had formally withdrawn from the organization. The footnote reads, see Crisis of Conscience, pages 305 to 327. The label, not the reason, determines the treatment. The September 15th, 1981 Watchtower, which incidentally provided the means for taking disfellowshipping action toward me, asks the question, quote, would upholding God's righteousness and his disfellowshipping arrangement mean that a Christian should not speak at all with an expelled person, not even saying hello? The article then refers to the text at 2 John verse 9 through 11, which reads, everyone that pushes ahead and does not remain in the teaching of the Christ does not have God. He that does remain in this teaching is the one that has both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, never receive him into your houses or say a greeting to him, for he that says a greeting to him is a sharer in his wicked works. John's words are taken as ruling out any communication with organizationally expelled ones, not even allowing a simple hello. Those words, however, in no way support the claim. First, it should be noted that what is at issue is the teaching of the Christ, not the teaching of some religious movement. John's first letter shows that for him, such teaching was centered on the fundamental Christian confession that Jesus was the Christ, whom God had sent on earth in the flesh. The footnote references 1 John chapter 2, verse 22, 23, and 29, chapter 3, verse 23, chapter 4, verse 2 and 3, and chapter 5, verses 1 through 5. The rest of the scriptures clearly show that the criterion for baptism was sincere belief that Jesus the Nazarene was indeed the Christ, that he gave his life for mankind and had been resurrected, and putting in practice his teachings and morals. There's a footnote here referencing Romans chapter 10, verses 6 through 9, 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 3, compare 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 2, and Matthew chapter 16, verses 16 and 17. It was not belief in a complex set of unique teachings developed over centuries by some religious movement such as the Watchtower organization, nor of observance of an equally complex set of organizationally determined policies. Differences of view on other teachings of lesser significance would not be reason for divisions and separations, some cutting off others, shutting them out from fellowship. Thus the apostle urges, quote, accept among you the man who is weak in the faith, but do not argue with him about his personal opinions, or on disputable matters, New International Version. Romans 14, verse 1, TEV. The Watchtower endeavors to gloss over this by relegating the disputable matters to inconsequential matters of opinion, taste, or variations of conscience. Footnote reads, The Watchtower, September 1st, 1981, page 20. This simply ignores the context, which shows that the apostle specified such issues as the eating of certain foods and the observance of certain days as holy. Romans chapter 14, verses 2 through 23. These were in no way inconsequential issues, particularly for Jewish believers. Belief in eating anything, verse 2, would include eating of meats offered to idols or the flesh of pigs, and these were matters of the greatest seriousness for Christians of Jewish origin. This is seen in that some were actually judging the standing of others with God on this basis, something very unlikely if, as the Watchtower would imply, this had to do with mere matters of taste, such as the incidental preferences of diet found in modern society and which have nothing to do with religious scruples. Footnote says, compare Leviticus 11, 7 and 8, Isaiah 66, 17, and 1 Corinthians 8, 7 through 13. The Watchtower of December 1st, 1977 contained a discussion of Romans chapter 14, written by Edward Dunlap, which accurately presented the seriousness of the issues involved. Subsequent articles have simply ignored the evidence there presented. The observance of certain days, verses 5 and 6, such as the Sabbath, was a very crucial point in Jewish worship, and violation of the Sabbath rest was counted among the greatest of sins. Jewish converts to Christianity would not easily adjust to viewing one day as all others. Yet, despite differences of viewpoint on such serious issues, the exhortation was not to use them in judging the standing of others, and not to let them be sources of separation. Watchtower policies fail to follow the Apostolic Council. They actually presume to do the opposite of what is said by making decisions on inward questionings, passing judgment on disputable matters, and using such debatable matters in condemning those who are not theirs to condemn, since the persons are each someone else's servant, and whether he stands or falls, it is his own master's business. Romans 14, 1 and 4, Jerusalem Bible. The Living Bible here reads, They are God's servants, not yours. They are responsible to Him, not to you. None of these differences of viewpoint or understanding, then, are involved in the Apostle John's description of one who, quote, does not remain in the teachings of the Christ. Notice the Watchtower's discussion of the rest of John's exhortation conform to the facts. Note this discussion of the word greeting found in this text as presented in the July 15th, 1985 Watchtower, page 31. The article reads, John added, For he that says a greeting to him is a sharer in his wicked works, 2 John 11. Here John used the Greek word of greeting, kairo, rather than the word aspazomai found in verse 13. Kairo meant to rejoice, Luke 10:20, Philippians 3, verse 1, and chapter 4, verse 4. It was also used as a greeting spoken or written, Matthew 28, verse 9, Acts 15:23, and chapter 23, verse 26. Aspazomai meant to unfold the arms, thus to greet, to welcome, Luke 11:43, Acts 20, verse 1, 37, and chapter 21, verse 7 and 19. Either could be used as a salutation, but aspazomai may have implied more than a polite hello or good day. Jesus told the 70 disciples not to aspasethi anyone. He thus showed that their urgent work allowed no time for the Eastern way of greeting with kisses, embraces, and long conversation. Luke 10, verse 4. Peter and Paul urged, greet, aspasethi, one another with a kiss of love or a holy kiss. 1 Peter 5:14, 2 Corinthians 13:12 and 13, and 1 Thessalonians 5:26. So John may deliberately have used kairo in 2 John 10 and 11 rather than aspazomai, verse 13. If so, John was not urging Christians then to avoid merely warmly greeting with an embrace, kiss, and conversation, a person who taught falsehood or who renounced the congregation or apostatized. Rather, John was saying that they ought not even to greet such an individual with a kairo, or a common good day. Whoever wrote this material, repeated in the April 15, 1988 Watchtower, evidently overlooked or ignored the account in Luke 1, 28 and 29. The Watchtower seeks to attribute to the term aspazomai a special warmth of greeting, distinctively surpassing that of the word used in John's second letter, kairo. That would enable it to say that kairo, being so much less warm than aspazomai, would relate to more commonplace, perfunctory greetings, including a simple hello. On this basis, they could rule out any verbal communication whatsoever with those they disfellowship. In Luke's account, however, we read the following of God's angel's visit to Mary. Quote, "And he came to her and said, 'Greetings,' or in Greek, 'Kair,' favored one, the Lord is with you." But she was much perplexed by his words and pondered what sort of greeting, Greek aspasmos, this might be. And the reference is here made to Luke chapter 1, verse 28-29, NRSV. The two words are here obviously used interchangeably. Mary applies the term aspasmos to the word kair, pronounced by the angel. She did not do this because the angel had, in the Watchtower definition, enfolded her in his arms or kissed her, nor had he at this point engaged in a long conversation with her. She refers not to an embrace or kiss, but to his words. The footnote reads, at verse 40, a form of aspazomai is again used in referring to Mary's greeting Elizabeth, but, once again, it is simply verbal, for verse 41 speaks of Elizabeth as hearing the greeting, not receiving some warm embrace or kiss. Not only does it commit this error, but the Watchtower also fails to recognize that the Greek verb kairin, used by John, does not relate to some simple greeting, such as hello. It is not the least bit less warm than the other Greek term discussed. To the contrary, the term kairin literally means to be rejoicing and corresponds to the Hebrew term shalom, meaning peace be with you. The footnote reads, see the interlinear reading of 2 John verse 10 and 11 in the Kingdom Interlinear Translation of the Greek Scriptures. It was used to express not a mere commonplace greeting, but to express personal or social favor and acceptance, even to express recognition of authority. The footnote reads, the official Roman exclamation, Hail Caesar, is thus rendered in Greek as Kair, Kaisar, and the Roman soldiers mockingly used the term in addressing Jesus as the King of the Jews at Matthew 27:29. Recognizing this, some translations, rather than rendering it as simply greeting, render it as to welcome. The footnote reads, see 2 John verse 10 in the New International Version, the New English Bible, the New Revised Standard Version. Capturing well the sense of John's words, one translation reads, quote, do not welcome him into your home, do not even say, peace be with you. Don't encourage him in any way, the Living Bible. For anyone who wishes him peace becomes his partner in the evil things he does. Footnote references 2 John 10 and 11 TEV. Clearly then, what a Christian denies to an antichrist is not some simple salutation, such as hello or how do you do, but denies him the address, which implies acceptance and agreement with his person or cause, wishing him favor and success. To welcome him in this manner would indeed make one a sharer in his wicked works. To the contrary, simply talking to a person does not of itself imply acceptance, agreement, or favor. It is what one says that determines this. Certainly one does not become his partner in the evil thing he does if one endeavors to refute him or talk him out of his wrong views, convincing him of the error of his ways. Quite the opposite. The Scriptures show this can be a Christian duty. The footnote says, compare James 5:19 and 20, 2 Timothy 2:24 through 26, and Titus 1:10 through 13. In its latest policy adjustment allowing elders to initiate contact with disfellowshipped or disassociated persons, the Watchtower specifies that, quote, no visit would be made on any who evidence a critical, dangerous attitude. The Watchtower, April 15th, 1991, page 23. By its policy forbidding any speech with those it arbitrarily designates as apostates, the Watchtower organization not only maintains a sterile atmosphere within the membership, assuring that they will not be confronted with any convincing evidence of error on the organization's part, but the organization also escapes from having to respond to such evidence itself. It can simply shrug this off as from an apostate source. Persons who have read Crisis of Conscience and who have written or phoned the Brooklyn headquarters have routinely had their questions ignored on this basis. Phone inquiries bring the response, no comment. This stonewalling is justified by the claim that it would be wrong to discuss anything from an apostate source. Even if the charge of apostasy were true, which in most cases it is not, this is still an artificial excuse, a pretext that simply has no scriptural support. The first chapter of the book of Job depicts Jehovah as speaking with and engaging in a controversial discussion with Satan, the first and greatest of apostates. The Watchtower publications discussing this say that Jehovah accepted the challenge made by Satan and that this acceptance ultimately produced beneficial results, though for a time bringing much suffering to Job. The footnote reads, see You Can Live Forever in Paradise on Earth, pages 105 to 111. Also, The Watchtower, November 1st, 1986, page 31. Yet they themselves refuse to meet any challenge resulting from evidence that confronts their claims and which would call for no more than simple, open discussion, not intense suffering. Jehovah sent his prophets persistently to those he himself described as an apostate nation, renegade sons. Isaiah 10, verse 6, Jeremiah 3, 12 through 14. He did not condone their wrongdoing, minimizing their sins, but he was willing to set matters straight with them, contend with them, even enter into controversy with them to make plain their wrong and accomplish their redemption. Isaiah 1, verse 18, Jeremiah 2, 9 and 35. Compare Isaiah 50, 7 and 8. God's Son did not hesitate to answer Satan, the great apostate, even quoting Scripture in refuting his temptations. Matthew 4, 1 through 11. He described the religious leaders of Jehovah's Covenant people in his day as sons of Gehenna, a brood of vipers, murderers, offspring of the devil. Yet he continually addressed them, responded to their questions, and exposed their claims and arguments. Matthew 23, 15 and 33, John 8 and 44. His apostles followed his example, not only with this class of men, but with persons who professed Christianity and who advanced false teachings or sought to lead other Christians astray. One has but to read the apostolic letters to see that they do not seek to evade answering arguments from such sources, but frankly confront them and refute them. One of the most potentially disturbing questions one can ask a religious leader is, by what authority do you do these things? Footnote makes reference to Matthew 21, 23. Rather than deal frankly with sober evidence presented by sincere persons questioning exclaimed authority, the Watchtower organization disfellowships those who do express themselves in this way. When Paul's apostleship was challenged, he did not shrink from the challenge, but provided his challengers with extensive evidence confirming his apostleship, dealing with specific issues or complaints and accusations from opposers. The footnote references 1 Corinthians 1, 10 through 17, chapter 3, 4 through 10, chapter 4, 1 through 16, chapter 9, 1 through 18, chapter 15, 9 through 11, 2 Corinthians chapter 6, 3 through 13, chapter 7, verses 2 and 3, and 8 through 13, chapter 10, verses 7 through 13, chapter 11, verses 5 through 27, chapter 12, 11 through 13, and 16 through 19. As he himself says, He did not do this by an authoritarian stance or by, quote, terrorizing them either through letter or by deed. Compare 2 Corinthians 1:24, chapter 10, verses 1, 8, and 9. He did not presumptuously dare to recommend himself, nor did he use fleshly weapons of harassment, deceit, or sophistry, as his challenges did. He did not use the weapon of threatening excommunication toward those questioning his position. Footnote references 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 1, chapter 10, verses 3, 4, 12, and 18, and chapter 12, verse 16. Compare 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 16. In his counsel to Timothy, Paul urged him to stay clean from wrong influence and to avoid contentious debating. At the same time, he did not instruct Timothy to combat such things with a show of authority or by threatening organizational reprisals, but instead urged him to strive to instruct with mildness those who were guilty of this and who needed to repent and to come free from the snare of the devil. The reference is made to 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 14 through 26. Genuine Christians today should follow the example of God, His Son, and His Son's apostles, not that of an authoritarian organization. More erroneous distinctions. Since the Watchtower organization especially rules out any conversation of a spiritual nature with disfellowshipped persons, it faces a problem with dealing with Paul's exhortation at 2 Thessalonians 3, 14 and 15. In the New World Translation, his words read, quote, "But if anyone is not obedient to our word through this letter, keep this one marked. Stop associating with him, that he may become ashamed. And yet do not be considering him as an enemy, but continue admonishing him as a brother." Since following this counsel would not support or suit their policy of complete shunning, the Watchtower classes this as treating of a less serious case than involved in disfellowshipment, and thus they set up a separate category called marking, which allows for less drastic measures and attitude toward those marked. They would thereby make it appear that the treatment here discussed is different from that of 1 Corinthians chapter 5, 9 through 11. But is it? The context shows that the offense is disobedience to the written word of an apostle sent by Christ. Certainly this is no minor matter. The Watchtower organization surely would not view it in that light if it were a matter of witnesses disregarding its own declaration of policies or teaching. In its discussion of the text, the Watchtower of April 15, 1985, page 31, quotes Paul's words, "Stop associating with him," and then says, quote, "Brothers would not completely shun him, for Paul advised them to continue admonishing him as a brother. Yet by their limiting, note, not terminating, social fellowship with him, they might lead him to become ashamed." What the Watchtower fails to recognize or to acknowledge is that the Greek phrase Paul used for "stop associating with" is the identical phrase he used at 1 Corinthians 5:11, where the New World Translation renders it, "quit mixing in company with." This can be seen in the interlinear reading of the Kingdom Interlinear Translation. There is no difference in the force of the term in both texts. In both cases, Christians are urged to avoid intimate fellowship on a personal level with persons committing the wrongs described either in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 or in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3. Doing this so that the wrongdoer may become ashamed. That is the extent of the counsel, nothing more. The footnote reads, "It may be noted that even when the apostle speaks of a man who is disputatious to the point of being divisive, and who has received repeated admonitions about this, his counsel does not absolutely prohibit any speaking with him. At Titus chapter 3, verse 10, the Greek word sometimes rendered reject actually has the meaning of begging off from or excusing oneself. Compare the use of the same term at Hebrews 12:25 and Luke 14:18 and 19. The New English Bible renders it by "have done with him." So even in this case, there is still allowance for common courtesy in dealing with such ones, politely but firmly excusing oneself from being drawn into useless debates with them. Back to the paragraph. In the Christian Association, there was ample room for personal differences. The teachings concerning Christ's messiahship, his sacrificial death, resurrection, and glorification, the benefits therefrom of salvation by faith, the operations of the Holy Spirit, and Christ's teachings and morality were strongly defended and viewed as essential for membership in his body. Footnote reads, compare Galatians 2, verses 4 and 5. But even in such matters as disbelief in the resurrection, the wrong view was treated as a weakening in the brother's spirituality, and measures were taken to help by providing the necessary proof, rather than engaging in summary accusations of apostasy or by punitive actions by an ecclesiastical judiciary. Footnote reads 1 Corinthians 15, 12 through 57. It may be of interest to know that several of the points that have here been discussed were brought to the governing body's attention as much as 20 years ago. In the development of a new organizational manual prepared by Carl Adams, Edward Dunlap, and myself, I had prepared the section dealing with disfellowshipping and related issues. As mentioned in Chapter 6, Carl Adams, then the overseer of the writing department, submitted a memorandum to President Knorr explaining why certain adjustments were being recommended. See pages 188 and 189 in Chapter 6. Carl himself clearly recognized the validity of many of the points that have here been discussed, as seen from these sections of pages 17 and 18 of his memorandum. Quote, "We have viewed Matthew 18:17 as meaning disfellowshipping. Jesus said that when a man involved refused to listen to the congregation, we should let him be just as a man of the nations and as a tax collector. Exactly what does this mean as to the action we should take toward disfellowship persons? The Jews did not refuse to have any dealings at all with such persons or refuse to speak to them. In connection with Matthew 18 and 17, it would be helpful to consider 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verses 6, 14, and 15, and along with this, 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 25 and 26, and James 5, 19 and 20. In those texts, particularly the last two, strong expressions are used. Persons are said to have been in the snare of the devil, having been caught alive by him for the will of that one, misled from the truth, perhaps having a multitude of sins. Yet it seems implied that there was freedom to do what could be done to admonish and restore these persons. Shouldn't we be doing that today? No friendly or intimate association, such as would imply approval of their wrongdoing, need exist. The Greek verb used at 2 Thessalonians 3:14 in the expression stop associating is the very same word used at 1 Corinthians 5:11, quit mixing in company with. This latter text we have used to apply to persons whom we disfellowship or quit mixing in company with. But 2 Thessalonians shows that to quit mixing in company with someone does not rule out admonishing him, hence speaking to him. If we say that by giving scriptural admonition or reproof to them, we are guilty of spiritual fellowship with them, would this not also mean that when we witness to persons of different faiths, even clergymen, we have spiritual fellowship with them? Is our view of disfellowshipping really governed by these texts, or have we been reading into them more rigidity than is there? As in other cases, the scriptural reasons presented were both solid and thought-provoking. Yet, as was typical of governing body discussions then and thereafter, they received only the briefest of consideration. The material submitted was read out, and then opinions were expressed as to the advisability or inadvisability of making adjustments, not through a prayerful consideration of the scriptural evidence, but simply on the basis of what the particular member speaking viewed as advisable for the organization policy. The traditional position was retained. 20 years later, it was, if anything, even more rigid than it was then.